This is simply going to be a brief one-part study on the doctrine of the military as to its importance. So I'm doing this to answer a question on some things that I have said with regard to, I think that we ought to have a very strong, massive, if possible, as much as we can possibly afford, tax-wise, without breaking the backs of our taxpayers and placing too much of a burden on them, but to have a strong, powerful military armed to the teeth with every conceivable weapon, every weapon possible. Now, it's not that I am for war. I'm not ready to declare war on anybody. As President Reagan said, the bombing starts in the next 5 minutes. That's not the point. The point is, I believe that a powerful military is a deterrent to war. If you want peace, you've got to have a military. And if you want somebody to protect you, they've got to be bigger and stronger and smarter than the criminal that is attacking you. Now, this isn't something that's just simply my opinion. I would tell you if it were. But as you know, I put my nose in this book so that I can collectively and categorically and systematically teach you the truth. It's no good if we're just going through a religious exercise. And I know there is a special place in heaven for all of you who have missed the Super Bowl. just to be here. We're going to fellowship together, and all the rest of the peons are going to be in their little place, and we're going to be up in the rose garden of heaven having a celebration there, and we're going to call it the Victors of the Universal Bowl in the angelic conflict. By the way, you're a participant in that. I believe you've won a victory, and I do appreciate that. And it's not that the Super Bowl's not good. I'm interested too. I've always been a sports fan. But this is sitting back and being a spectator. Nothing wrong with that necessarily, but in the angelic conflict, if you're a spectator, you're a loser. And right now, as you're taking down this, having these thoughts go through your brain, having the Holy Spirit to assimilate them into your human spirit, you are being victorious. You want to know what God says. Actually, you're being a soldier, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. So to introduce this, again, we come up with two words that are so important: divine establishment. God has ordained certain laws and institutions. They are divine for the provision and protection of human freedoms. Each and every one of these things actually has a way in order to provide for freedom. And in this particular case, we're going to deal with three things that protect your person, your privacy, and your property. Now, as you see them here, all the way from, we've got 9 of the 10 listed: nature, self, marriage, family, church, school, business, military, nation. There are 3 of these that especially help you in 3 areas in which you are at war. First of all, yourself. Did you know you're at war with yourself? It's called the flesh. Now, only you can win that battle. Only you can put the sword of the Word of God to your flesh and beat it. But it's declared a war against you. And we're going to see that in point 1 in a moment. The second one is church. Church helps you to fight the devil. And when you come here, You're actually taking in ammunition. That's what you're doing. Each and every concept, every thought, every verse that we go over, and you catch it and you see it and you put it in yourself. Later you can bring it forth as a bullet, as it were, an arrow, a sword, and you can ward off the devil or any rankings of the fallen angels that happen to attack you. But now, there's a third enemy, and that is the world. And I don't know if you know it or not, but actually the military is the very thing that helps you against the world. Now, you also volitionally are responsible for fighting the philosophy of the world, fighting being conformed to the world, Romans 12, 1 and 2. You're responsible for that. But as far as your freedom, for example, to be here tonight, do you know who won that freedom for you? Do you know why we are not slaves to Japan or Germany? Guess who won that? Guess who did that for you? The army did. Brave men and women who faced Hitler and the land of the rising sun and beat them on the battlefields of the world. Why? Because Hitler was into the occult and the others are into ancestor worship, the Japanese, and they wanted to enforce that in the world. They were going to dominate and win the world. Who kept your freedoms alive? A soldier did. Somebody who went from here to that land and fought on their shores, keeping you free and safe. Now, you wouldn't know it, but we are extremely patriotic here, and we appreciate people who do that. Now, point one, then. You are already at war. Pastor, I'm in no shape to be at odds with anybody. You better be. You are at war with three types of entities. One is the flesh, one is the devil, and one is the world. Romans 7:23. Paul said, I see another law in my members. This is the old sin nature, warring against the law of my mind. If you're not filled with the Spirit, you are brought into captivity to the law of sin which is in your members. You're at war. Now, either you're going to kill it through the Holy Spirit, or it's going to capture you and make you its slave. Either or. That's why we emphasize so much this matter of the filling of the Spirit and learning how to sustain it. Why? Because it's spirituality is an absolute. You're either carnal or spiritual, depending. James 4:1 says, From whence come wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence even of the lust that war in your members? Ye lust and have not, ye kill and desire to have and cannot obtain. Ye fight and war, yet ye have not because ye ask not. Ye receive not because ye ask amiss, to consume it on your lusts. That's the flesh. And of course, chapter 2, verse 11 of 1 Peter says this, Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lust, which war against the soul. So, you have an enemy, and all you have to do is go to a mirror, and you can meet him or her. It's you. In that flesh is your enemy, and it wants to war against your soul. It is a soldier. It battles every single day. We've got this enemy. He's lurking about. He's going to rear his ugly head. He's going to fire his arrows at you unless you defeat him. Okay, there's a second enemy then. 2 Corinthians chapter 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Verses 3 and 4. For though we walk in the flesh. Now what the Apostle Paul is saying here, yes, I'm alive physically. He's in flesh 5 though, not in flesh 4. That's the point he's trying to make here. But even though I'm in flesh 5, I'm still in the flesh, but we do not war after the flesh. And we'll see why in Ephesians 6. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, that is fleshly, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. In other words, Satan cannot keep you captive. The book of Timothy tells us that he can take some people captive at his will. He just simply uses the flesh, he uses temptation, and he puts you behind bars, as it were. But you have the strength to break down the barriers of the devil. But they're not carnal weapons, because our enemy is not carnal. Ephesians 6. This is military language. Verse 11, put on the whole armor of God. Why do I say be armed to the teeth? God says to be armed to the teeth. The whole armor, front, back, for your feet, for your head, shield, whatever. Everything is needed. If one piece is missing, you're vulnerable. If all the pieces are there, you're incapable of being defeated. But as soon as you let down your guard, take off the armor. That's why he says, soldier. And this translates over into today's military. Put on the whole armor, that you might be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, spiritual wickedness in high places. Therefore take to you the whole armor of God. That's the only way you can stand against the wicked one. And he talks about it there as you read down. One of the things that you especially need to take is in verse 17. Last part of the verse. The sword of the Spirit. Now, here's one of the reasons that we do not favor gun legislation and keeping guns from the hands of responsible citizens. Yes, of course, it must be regulated from teenagers who are indiscriminately, randomly killing people on the street. Yes, of course. Bringing guns into schools and the like. But what Lucifer wants us to have is the liberal mentality of militarily laying down our weapons. Why? Because we're going to do the same thing to the devil on the inside. We're just simply, oh sure, here's my sword. Swords for guns. Swords, I saw the other day, guns for tickets to the Reba McEntire country music show. She was on a news broadcast, and she said, if you put in your guns, I'll give you tickets to my show. I'll be a cold day in Georgia before I'll ever see Reba McEntire, before I'll trade my gun in. And it'll be a cold day before I'll ever put down the sword of the Spirit. Because Lucifer has no intention of putting his sword down. And as soon as you do, as soon as you are incapable of hurting him back, then you're done. You are a defeated enemy and captured. Now, let's look at the third enemy here. John 15, verse 18. Now, the third enemy that we have is the world. But what is it that keeps the world from crushing in on us and killing off all Christians? The military. I'll show you what I mean here in a moment. Even unbelievers understand divine establishment, and that if they don't want somebody to break the law against them, then they're going to have to keep the law and have an enforcement arm of their national entity to preserve order. Verse 18, if the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. Does the world hate us? Yes. Why doesn't it unleash its hatred? Because of law enforcement officers. If you are of the world would love its own, but the world hates you. If they have persecuted me, they'll persecute you. But why don't they do it on a massive scale? It's the military. Turn to Revelation 13. There's going to come a time when the world, through Antichrist, is going to have the capability of making war with the saints. And by the way, we're very privileged here in the United States of America. If we were to go to other countries and try to practice our so-called faith there, for example, Iraq, do you suppose that Saddam Hussein would allow us to practice openly and freely, without reprisal, without being arrested or persecuted? He would not. And he's got the military on his side. So therefore, he can keep his people in bondage and Christians out of the land or under his thumb. Why? The military, the law enforcement. That's why. And one of these days, the world is going to turn totally that way. As long as we have a nation like America who keeps its military strong, Saddam Hussein cannot force us to do anything or take away our freedoms. Verse 4, they worship the dragon which gave power to the beast. They worship the beast, saying, who is like him? Who is able to make war with him? Verse 7, but it was given to him through this military machine that he now has gotten to make war with the saints and to overcome them. The world doesn't like believers. The world hates the saints. And the world hates the Lord Jesus Christ. That should be chapter 17 there. I'm sorry. I made an error. Chapter 17, verses 13 and 14. These, meaning the 10 kings of the kingdom of Antichrist, have one mind and shall give their power and strength to the beast. This is their military might. These shall make war with the Lamb, but the Lamb shall overcome them. How does he do it? How does Jesus Christ overcome people who want to annihilate the saints of God, take their freedom to worship God away from them? How does Jesus Christ do it? He's the Lord of hosts, literally. Armies. Verse 11 of Revelation 19. I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat on him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he does judge and make war. Verse 14, the armies which were in heaven followed him upon white horses. Jesus Christ, in a military action, takes this world for himself against evil people. That's why we believe in the military. Turn to Acts chapter 21. Acts chapter 21. Paul came down to Jerusalem. Summarize this real quickly, verse 26. He took some men and entered into the temple. Then as he was coming out, verse 27, middle part, the Jews which were of Asia, they saw him in the temple and stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, crying, Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teaches all men everywhere against the people, the law, and this place. He's polluted the temple. Now, what happened? Verse 30, all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul, drew him out of the temple, and shut the doors. And as they were about to kill him, Mighty Mouse to the rescue. Who comes and gets him? Tidings came to the chief captain of the band in Jerusalem. It was the army that kept peace there, part of the military that protected the civilians, who immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, what did they do? They left off. They stopped beating Paul. Now, I will bet you the Apostle Paul praised the Lord for the military. And I will bet you he praised the Lord that they were stronger and mightier than that mean, vicious mob that was just about to tear him limb from limb. That's the only way this chief captain would have stopped them. Okay, fine. You want to kill this man? You're going to have to get through us first. In Rome, there was no such thing as an unlawful riot or gathering. So let's go to Romans. Chapter 13, point 2. Freedom, therefore, is won and preserved only by the threat and or exercise of a greater force inflicting righteous violence. This is why children should be spanked. This is why kids in school need to have the threat of punishment, something that is going to hurt. If indeed they threaten a teacher, they should be threatened within an inch of their life. Give me some of this liberal nonsense. Oh, well, they're just victims of their society. They know right and wrong. They know exactly what they're doing. Yes, I understand some of that, but it's nonsense. If an authority is threatened and they've done nothing wrong, an elderly woman, say, in a classroom, that these big strapping teenage fellows are saying, I'm going to get you, and threaten them, they ought to be lynched. Pastor, teenagers? Yes, teenagers. Let every soul be subject to the higher powers. And if they've got parents who say, well, now it's the teacher's fault, and it usually always is in the society today. There is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. If you resist the power, you resist the ordinance of God. Rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, you'll be praised. He is a minister of God to thee for good. Do that which is evil? No, be afraid. He bears not the sword in vain. To do what? Execute wrath. Now, it's high time we need to understand that you don't go around beating up on people, innocent people, of course, innocent kids, of course. But if they have the strength of an adult, have the weapons of an adult, and are threatening and so forth, it is right to use the force necessary to constrain them and or punish them if necessary. He bears not the sword in vain. Now, it's not just that. It's with criminals. And that, of course, is what we're going to talk about in the next point. But let's go to Revelation 19. Revelation 19, verse 11. Here's where we get the idea of it's right to use a greater force of righteous violence to subdue criminal activity wherever it's found. Last part of verse number 11. In righteousness he does judge and make war. How does he do it? He comes down, and with the effulgence of his glory, the greatest power in the universe, he melts the flesh off their bones, and that's it. The criminals are gone. No more war. Jesus won the victory. All right, point 3. Let's go to Acts 16. I got on a soapbox there, and I looked up at the time, and time's about to get away from me. I have to just stick to the point and not allow my zeal, my earnest zeal, to come out with regard to this. Point 3, protection of a national entity is the responsibility of two law enforcement agencies. One is on the interior, the other is the exterior. Both are considered military. All others are considered civilians. In the interior, you have a constabulary against criminals. Acts 16. Starting with verse 19. Now, even though these members of the law enforcement here were influenced in the wrong way, the point is that they corrected themselves later with the arrest of Paul. And when her masters saw that the hope of their gains was gone, verse 19, they caught Paul and Silas, drew them to the marketplace to the rulers, brought them to the magistrates, that's the constabulary, the police officers. These men, being Jews in a troublous city and so forth, they told them to take their clothes off. And then verse 23, when they had laid many stripes on them, they cast them in prison, charging the jailer to keep them safely. It is right when there are indeed criminals and they are acting incorrectly, taking your person, privacy, or property. It is right to either arrest them, constrain them, confine them, and even to kill them if necessary, if it means protecting innocent lives. I had somebody the other day, or they were talking about this guy went here and killed this person, skipped to the next state, killed that person, went to there, and he only got like 25 years or something, but he's eligible for parole in 9 years. And he had killed all of these people. And the question was asked, what about execution? That's why the Bible says he bears not the sword in vain. But in America today, we don't want that. We don't have the stomach to get rid of people who are really hurting our society. 1 Samuel. The current administration wants to persecute Bible believers and let criminals go. 1 Samuel 17. Either in a repelling of an invading foreign army, foreign soldiers, or to leave shores and go to other shores to confine the war to the enemy's territory, so that everything that's inflicted by way of property damage is done on his shore rather than your shore. That's the job of the military, and we salute them. That's the exterior part. Verse 1, chapter 17, 1 Samuel. The Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, were gathered together at Shochoh. Verse 2, Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. Point. The Philistines are an invading army. And before you get into our land, we've met you at the border, and we're going to fight you for that right. We're going to fight you for our land, fight you for our property. And that is why we need to keep a very strong military. Okay, we're in 1 Samuel. Let's go to point 4. Freedom depends on which army wins. One army defends freedom, the other army destroys freedom. You've got to think about it that way. If Saddam Hussein's 1 million man army had not been met with an army such as ours, and he had the capability of transporting that army, he would move from nation to nation as a very ambitious warmonger, anxious to further his own ends around the world. How do we know that one army defends freedom and the other destroys it? Note what Goliath of Gath said, verse 4. Their champion said, instead of killing everybody off, verse 8, Why are you come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine? You servants to Saul, choose you a man. No sense in going through all this bloodletting. The reason being, he's thinking, if we kill you all off, we won't have slaves afterwards. We're anxious to take a few slaves here so that we can have you to do our dirty work for us. So choose you a man. Let him come to me. If he fights with me and kills me, we'll be your servants. If I prevail against him and kill him, then you'll be our servants. That's the point. Servitude. You don't have your freedom if you don't have an army, or you yourself do not stand up and fight against people who are anxious to take your freedom away. Verse 48. Came to pass when the Philistines arose and drew nigh to meet David, David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. You know the story. He put his hand in the sling, and the little song, he went round and popped Goliath right in the forehead, between the eyes. Last part of verse 51. When the Philistine army saw their champion was dead, what did they do? They fled. They weren't so anxious now to come into the territory and to spoil the Israelis. They weren't so anxious. Why? Because somebody was willing to take a stand and fight for what was right. So what did they do? The men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines, and many fell by the sword and so forth. Israel returned, chasing the Philistines, and they spoiled their tents. Okay. Jeremiah 40, verse 1. Word came to Jeremiah from the Lord. After that, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, had let him go from Ramah, when he had taken him, being bound in chains, among all that were carried away captive of Jerusalem, which were carried away captive into Babylon. What happened? Nebuchadnezzar sent his army down. They sieged Jerusalem 3 times. They finally took the city, but each time they took the citizens of Israel off their land and made them their slaves. Numbers chapter 1.5. Since the battlefield decides freedom, and since every man is responsible for defending his own freedom, universal military training is an important function of the national life of each of its generations. Now, many of us here came out of the Vietnam War generation, and with all of the things that happened there with regard to draft card burning, draft dodging, going to Canada, and everything of the sort. Since we're saved, since we see things differently, would to God that every generation were required to at least have 2 years of military training to learn how to use a weapon, to learn how to fight, throw a grenade, and so forth. It's important. Why? Because as the men of the generation before them age, younger men in other nations get rambunctious. And unless we have an ongoing generational training in the military, the older men cannot fight the younger men, and it ends up that the nation declines and is defeated. Universal military training is taught in the Scriptures. Verse 2, Numbers 1, take ye the sum of all the congregation of Israel, after their families, every male by their poles, their heads, 20 years old and upward, all that are able to go forth to war in Israel. Thou and Aaron shalt number them by their armies. 45. So were all those numbered of the children of Israel, all that were able to go forth to war, even all that were numbered, and it tells 600,000 people. Why was that important? It's important because the other men are getting older. Somebody's going to have to know how to fight to protect them. They've done their part. Now somebody else has to stand in the breach. Judges 3. Judges 3. Joshua Judges. Now these are the nations, verse 1, which the Lord left to prove Israel by them, even as many of Israel as had not known all the wars of Canaan, only that the generations of the children of Israel might know, to teach them war, at the least such as never knew nothing thereof. In other words, God reserved some of the nations of Canaan there as they were fighting to say, okay, the generation of Joshua and Caleb went in there and they cleaned house. But now I left a few to teach the younger men coming up so that they might in turn know how to fight to preserve their culture, their society, their land, and their families. And that's point 6. Nehemiah 4. Point 6. We believe that the Bible teaches that every nation, especially a nation like America, should not, because of the so-called peace dividend, destroy our army, dismantle our army. That is crazy. To give the peace dividend to some who in the welfare system, now not all of them are, but most simply want a handout. And if we give the valuable commodities which protect us to somebody who's going to consume it upon their lust, it's going to cost us double to replenish our army and build our army. The materials won't be there. Now, another thing that every man should realize, and we'll see it here, is that they should be part and have this mentality because they're fighting for their families. Nehemiah 4, verse 7. It came to pass that Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabians, the Ammonites, and Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were made up and that the breaches were being stopped. They were angry. They conspired all of them together to come to fight against Jerusalem and to hinder it. Nevertheless, we made our prayer unto God and set a watch against them day and night because of them. Drop down to verse 13. Therefore set I the lower places behind the wall, and on the higher places I even set the people after the families with the swords, their spears, and their bows. I looked and rose up and said to the nobles and rulers and rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, which is great and terrible, and fight for your, now note, brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. Now, Nehemiah did a very wise thing here. He knew that these our armies had gathered together en masse, and they were going to come against Jerusalem. And so he said, okay, let's gather the people together, and here is your wife and your sons and your daughters right behind you. And here come the soldiers. Now between that army, which they'll probably kill your sons and rape your wives and daughters, between that army and your family is you. And if you don't want them raped, you're going to have to kill them. You're going to have to be mean and rude and ugly and nasty and do everything that you can to stop them there before they get there. Now, that's what it's teaching here. That's why we should maintain a standing army and make every man realize we're doing this because of women and children. We take the fight to the enemy, and because of our families. And anyway, what happened? Verse 15. It came to pass when our enemies heard that it was known to us that God had brought their counsel to naught, and we returned all of us to the wall, every one of us. What happened? They got scared. Hey, them boys mean business. They're organized. They're ready. And They're ready to do whatever it takes to protect their homes and their families right behind them. And that's exactly what he did. He organized the armies with the families behind them because there was no place to go. They were already in Jerusalem. They could not leave. Okay? Exodus 20:13 says, "Thou shalt not kill." What does Deuteronomy 7 say? Deuteronomy 7. Verse number 2, "When the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them and show no mercy unto them." What does "thou shalt not kill" really mean in the Hebrew? Ratzak is the Hebrew word. It means murder. It's talking about a criminal activity of killing an innocent victim. That's what it's talking about. Don't murder. Is it right to kill in war? You betcha. In fact, do you know David was a man after God's own heart. You know what David is noted for? Being a man of war. Do you know the warrior that has killed the most enemies and will kill the most people in battle is the Lord Jesus Christ. You can be filled with the Spirit and have a good aim and kill. And the more you kill, the more spiritual you are. All right, let's move on. Point 8. Deuteronomy chapter 20. Point 8 is, just have a few moments, we'll go fast, we're just about done. Unconditional surrender or annihilation are the only acceptable terms for peace. Anything else is unacceptable. Sometimes you have to take it, but as far as God's viewpoint is concerned, it's unacceptable. Verse 10, "When you come nigh to a city and fight against it, proclaim peace to it first. It shall be, if it make thee an answer of peace and open up to you, then it shall be that all the people that is found therein shall be tributaries unto thee, and they shall serve thee." Okay? That's unconditional surrender. Here we are, we're going to fight you, but if you're willing to surrender to us on our terms, you won't be hurt, your lives will be spared. But, verse 12, "If it will make no peace with thee, but will make war against it, then you'll besiege it, and you'll smite every man therein with the edge of the sword." Verse 13. And if you'll read on down through verse 18 there, talks about annihilation, even of the race, if need be. Matthew 24. We're going to hurry to finish these up. We're in Matthew and Luke. Despite the United Nations, despite all of the peace talk, Jesus Christ himself teaches that war will continue till the millennium. Matthew 24:6 says, "Ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. Don't be troubled. All these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." The end is the end of dispensation of law and the beginning of the millennium. What should this tell us as a nation? Peace, peace, but there is no peace. And unless we are ready to fight, not picking a fight, not at all, that's not what I'm talking about. But unless we understand that as long as men reject Christ and have an old sin nature, there will be men ready to pick a fight and to aggressively assert themselves for power and territory and domination like Antichrist. That brings us then to Luke 14:31, our last verse, and point 10. We've come full cycle to where we started off with our introduction. We believe that our soldiers should be provided with the best that we can provide for them. We should support them and arm them to the teeth. Why? Because they're fighting for our freedom. And the greatest deterrent to war is preparation. Who's the bully? He's usually somebody who is bigger than everybody else in the schoolyard. But you come and you get prepared, and you bring somebody that's bigger and stronger, and you have protection. You have somebody that's going to be a mediator for you and intercede on your behalf. Or verse 31. What king going to war against another king sits not down first and consults whether he be able with 10,000 to meet him that comes against him with 20,000? Point. If you don't have the manpower and the weaponry, you better stay home and tend to your knitting. Because the deterrent to war is to have an army that's equal and greater in force and number. And then the king will think twice before coming against you.